Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Crespin. I'm the director and curator of the Carl Albert Congressional Research and Studies Center. Welcome to the 2023 Julian J. Rothbaum Lecture on Representative Government. It's great to see everyone here in person again after our last lecture was online due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I should say, in a bit of irony, I'm up here recovering from COVID. Hence the mask. I have tested negative, so don't worry, I'm not going to spread to any of you. The Carl Albert Center is proud to sponsor this lectureship as it reflects our core mission to strengthen... Sorry, can we ask them to turn down the... Yeah. This will be good for you. Perfect. There we go. The Carl Albert Center is proud to sponsor this lectureship as it reflects our core mission to strengthen representative democracy through engaged and informed citizens. Now, more than ever, knowledge about how our democratic institutions are supposed to operate is desperately needed as our representatives struggle to work through important problems. Anyone following the news today has realized there's a lot of struggling going on, especially in the House. This year, the Center is proud to host its 21st Rothbaum Lecture, and it has been 40 years since our first speaker, John Bradamus, gave the inaugural lecture in 1983. As many of you know, our lecturers return to their home institutions to turn their talks into books published by the University of Oklahoma Press. The 16th book in the series, Under Fire and Underwater, Wildfire, Flooding, and the Fight for Climate Resilience in the American West, by 2019 lecturer Bruce Kane, is now available for pre-order. The book series is a marvelous legacy for the lecturer's namesake, Julian J. Rothbaum, as well as for the Center and the University of Oklahoma. Julian Rothbaum, a lifetime friend of Speaker Albert, was a leader in civic affairs and across the nation, and an important supporter of the University of Oklahoma. Mr. Rothbaum earned his undergraduate degree from OU in 1936, and then 2 years later graduated from OU Law. In addition to his successful business career, Julian made sure to give back to his state and his country. He served two terms in the Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma and another as Oklahoma State Regent for Higher Education. He and his wife, Irene, endowed professorships in the College of Arts and Sciences, in the College of Fine Arts, in the College of Law, and the Department of History. In addition, he established student awards in honor of his lifetime friend, Carl Albert, at 3 institutions of higher learning which Speaker Albert attended. Julian Rothbaum believed, as Speaker Albert, that education and public service are at the heart of a representative democracy. Before I move on to introduce our lecturer, I want to invite David Rebel, Dean of the Dodge Family College of Arts and Sciences and the Merrick Chair of Western American History, to say a few words about today's event and the importance of the values held by Julian Rothbaum and his family. Dean Rebel.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Great to see everyone. All right. First of all, I'd like to welcome our distinguished guest, Professor Francis E. Lee. It's wonderful to have you here with us. Professor Lee is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and really looking forward to your talk. My responsibility here is to provide very extensive introductory remarks. I'm going to limit them to 30 minutes or less. Mike, I'm just messing with you. You know I am. I won't do that. It really is an honor to be here for the 2023 Rothbaum Distinguished Lecture in Representative Government series. As many of you know, this is designed as a series of 3 related lectures with the general theme examining the role of representative institutions in the United States. The lecture series addresses 2 principles of major significance for its namesake, Julian Rothbaum, who I'll speak about in a minute. The importance of the relationship between education and public service in representative democracies, and the importance of participation by private citizens in public affairs. Now to our distinguished and very generous sponsor, Joel Jankowski. The lecture series was endowed in 1983 by Mr. Rothbaum's wife, Irene, and their son, Joel Jankowski. Joel is a longtime friend and supporter of the Carl Albert Center. He earned his undergraduate and law degrees from OU and was a former legislative assistant to Speaker Albert from 1972 to 1977. Joel is a partner emeritus of the law firm Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, LLP in Washington, D.C. He retired from partnership in 2019 after spending more than 4 decades advising clients on public policy matters. He was particularly focused on issues related to intellectual property, telecommunications, and technology. He's the chairman of the board of the Close-Up Foundation, a nonprofit, nonpartisan, civic education organization that believes a strong democracy requires active, informed participation by all citizens. And just to make sure everybody got that, a non-profit, non-partisan civic education organization. This is still possible in the United States, and we should be embracing it. He's been recognized nationally 2 times as one of America's best lawyers, and in 2019 was recognized as a government relations trailblazer. Joel embodies his family's commitment to public service and concern for representative democracy, and on behalf of the Dodge Family College of Arts and Sciences, we thank him for his continued commitment and the efforts he's made in support of this lectureship. Please join me in thanking our distinguished supporter, Joel Jankowski. Now, just a final word on the focus of the Rothbaum lecture series and how it connects with the goals of our college. The Dodge Family College of Arts and Sciences, as you know, has a clear mission to master existing knowledge and then to create new knowledge of the physical world and new understandings of the human condition through our research and scholarship, and then to put those new understandings to work to improve our communities. Our college is the oldest, the largest, thankfully no longer the poorest, and certainly the most disciplinarily and demographically diverse college at the University of Oklahoma. We teach all students at the university. We offer more than 50% of all the credit hours taught at OU, and we're working to develop our students intellectually and professionally to apply their expertise to local and global communities to make them stronger, safer, healthier, more peaceful, prosperous, sustainable, diverse, and humane. Under the leadership of Dr. Crespin, our Carl Albert Center is achieving our mission admirably. The focus and theme of this year's lecture series are as timely as ever. As we can see at this present moment, you may be checking your phones to see if we still have a speaker. And as a historian by training, I'm well aware that navigating the complexities of social and political divides has been absolutely vital for flourishing societies. And at OU, we take pride in the fact that we require every student to take courses in U.S. history and government, and we hope students will learn how to understand and engage civilly with others, including those with differing perspectives. We know this type of preparation is critical for them to succeed, and it's critical for our society to succeed. So, to conclude, thanks to everybody for being here. My best wishes for a wonderful and productive lecture series, and at this time I'd like to turn the program back over to Dr. Crespin, who's done a remarkable job of organizing this series along with many other members of the Carl Albert Center, Rachel Bloom included, and they deserve great credit and appreciation for their efforts, as does Joel Jankowski for his generous support. Thank you, Mike, Rachel, and others.
Thank you, Dean Rebell. Now to today's event. Before introducing our speaker, I do want to say there'll be some time for audience questions when Professor Lee is done with her lecture today. If you're going to ask a question, please wait for someone to bring a microphone to you, and Professor Lee will call on the questioners. In this series of lectures, titled Two Cheers for Congress, A Defense of Shared Power for a Polarized, Distrustful Society, award-winning Princeton University professor Francis Lee will defend the contemporary Congress through an empirical examination of its contributions to representation, policy formulation, and executive branch accountability. She argued that Congress is especially important and valuable for governance in today's deeply distrustful, polarized society. Dr. Lee is professor of politics and public affairs at Princeton University with a joint appointment in the Department of Politics and the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. She has broad interest in American politics with a special focus on congressional politics, national policymaking, party politics, and representation. She is the author and co-author of several books, including The Limits of Party, Congress and Lawmaking in a Polarized Era, Insecure Majorities, Congress and the Perpetual Campaign, Beyond Ideology, Politics, Principles, and Partisanship in the U.S. Senate, Sizing Up the Senate, The Unequal Consequences of Equal Representation, and a textbook I've assigned frequently in class, Congress and Its Members. Her research has appeared in the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, Perspective on Politics, Journal of Politics, Legislative Studies Quarterly, and other outlets. Professor Lee has been awarded many prizes, including the Richard Fenno Prize, the D.B. Hardeman Prize twice, the Gladys M. Kammerer Award, and the E.E. Schnattschneider Award. She is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It was an APSA Congressional Fellow. Professor Lee is editor of the Cambridge Elements Series in American Politics and a series editor for the Chicago Studies in American Politics. She was co-editor of Legislative Studies Quarterly from 2014 to 2019. Professor Lee earned her BA from the University of Southern Mississippi and her PhD from Vanderbilt University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lee as the 2023 Rothbaum Lecturer in Representative Government. The podium is yours.
All right. Thank you to Joel Jankowski and the rest of the Rothbaum family, to Mike Cresvin and his team at the Carl Albert Center, and to the University of Oklahoma for inviting me to give this year's Rothbaum Lectures in Representative Government. It's an honor to be here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you all. The title for my lectures is Two Cheers for Congress, and I'm going to be offering a defense of Congress. I'm glad not to have to be doing that in the midst of a government shutdown. I hope that you will not walk out when you learn that this is my title. Please bear with me. I want to begin these lectures in a spirit of appreciation, not critique. We've had so much critique of our governing institutions, really more than critique, almost doomsaying. We certainly have major problems, but the focus on the negative has gotten so one-sided. Almost nobody has had much good to say about Congress in recent years, or indeed during my whole time as a scholar focusing on the institution. I realize that I'm cutting against the grain in a major way in expressing any such appreciation. Americans have rarely been more negative on national government than they are right now. According to a recent poll conducted by the Pew Research Center, just 4% of American adults say that the political system is working extremely or very well. Perhaps more revealing is how respondents answered an open-ended question about the one word or phrase you would use to describe politics in the U.S. these days. Only 2% of respondents used a positive word of any kind. The most common 16 words are displayed in the word cloud shown here. Words like divisive, corrupt, messy, bad, chaos, dysfunction, joke. As I was working on my lectures this summer for a few weeks, Billboard's #1 song was a viral hit by a previously unknown singer-songwriter with an anthem about corrupt and out-of-touch politicians in Washington, D.C., the rich men north of Richmond. I don't think Oliver Anthony was only complaining about Congress, but Congress was definitely in his line of fire. This is one subject where average Americans actually agree with journalists. Americans aren't too fond of the news media either, but journalists and Americans share a common negative assessment of congressional politics. Just a couple of recent entries in this vein. Carl Holtz wrote during the pandemic that by any measure, Congress is a toxic mess, seemingly incapable of rising to the occasion even at a time of existential threats. Dan Balls, the chief correspondent for the Washington Post, wrote in January 22, though debate and discord have long been part of the American experience, the founding fathers probably did not anticipate the conditions that exist today, a largely broken Congress that struggles to function collectively to protect democracy or lacks the will to do so. Even members of Congress describe Congress as dysfunctional, often in pungent terms. In 2020, Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico said that the Senate had become a graveyard for progress. Representative Chip Roy of Texas routinely refers to Congress as the swamp. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made some news when she told a journalist that she was scandalized by the place every single day. Senator Joe Manchin summed it up, saying this place sucks. There's a broad bipartisan agreement on this point, at least. There's little dissent on this point in political science. Below are some of the titles of some recent books on the topic. For decades, Nolan McCarty has been documenting increasing party polarization in Congress. His indicators show that Congress has gotten more polarized every time he's updated his time series. Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein have produced a series of books beginning in the George W. Bush years, each of them proclaiming, as in the title of the latest installment, that it's even worse than it used to be. Two other notable books continue the theme. Anderson, Butler, and Young argue that members of Congress are unable to agree to reasonable compromises on policy because they are afraid of losing support in their party primaries. Gelman argues that rather than deal-making on meaningful policy change, parties in Congress are just playing politics as they angle for advantage looking towards the next election. My goal is not to refute all these criticisms of Congress. That wouldn't be possible. Many of the critiques are valid. Yet I think we are missing some important facts about the institution. There is a baby in that bathwater, and we need to pay it some attention. My goal is to focus on what it is that Congress constructively contributes to American government today. I'm going to be discussing the Congress we actually have in the here and now, not an ideal Congress, or what the institution might become if reforms were adopted. My focus is simply on the Congress as it exists. Why should we value it as an institution? What does it do for us, for American government? There's been so much Congress bashing for so long in our national discourse that I think there's been some forgetting about what makes a representative assembly important and valuable. And I'll argue that Congress as an institution deserves some appreciation despite its imperfections. You may, after due consideration, come away with a view of Congress just as negative as the one you likely entered with. But over these lectures, I hope to give at least some thought to what the Congress we have is good for. Its faults notwithstanding, I will argue that Congress today still serves three important purposes: representation, lawmaking, and executive accountability. These purposes are very different from one another. Representation is very different from lawmaking. Lawmaking is different from inquiring into the activities of the executive branch. But the activities inform one another. Being a representative helps you be a lawmaker, helps you discover what constituents need in terms of new laws. Looking closely into executive branch operations helps members identify where government is failing their constituents and where reforms are needed. But these activities also trade off against one another. Representation makes lawmaking difficult. Giving expression to a variety of voices makes it harder to agree on a common course of action. Agreement amidst diversity is often impossible. Holding the executive accountable can cut against working with the president to enact laws, and the president's signature is almost always necessary. Time spent on one purpose cannot be spent on another. Yet Congress deserves some credit for doing these things, still doing them even today. You know, the trade-offs that we see among these different values are part of the reason why Congress is always ripe for criticism. Congress can never fully achieve any of its purposes. I'll argue that Congress is even more important in doing these things now in our contemporary context than it was at many previous points. What Congress contributes in terms of representation is more valuable now than it was in a country that at its founding was a lot less diverse, a lot closer to Jefferson's vision of a nation of small yeoman farmers. The need for representation of the nation's diversity is greater now amidst a vast continental republic of 330 million people and an enormously complex society and economy. I will argue that the consensus-building function that Congress usually contributes to lawmaking is more needed now amidst today's party polarization. The American electorate is literally divided down the middle between the parties in terms of public support, and it has been for decades now. As I'll show in the lecture tomorrow, Congress's usual role is to force compromise and to put a brake on partisan ambitions. Congress's checks on the executive branch are more needed now, when presidents have become leaders of a global hegemon in possession of vast and ambiguous delegations of power. The resources available to presidents have grown right along with the increasingly extensive defense establishment and administrative state. A president like George Washington, presiding over 4 cabinet offices and fewer than 4,000 employees for the whole federal government, hardly needed to be monitored and checked in the way that presidents need to be today. He was already checked, if you will, simply by lesser capacity. The power of the federal government today is so much greater, and it makes the political accountability that Congress can bring to bear, consequently, even more significant. My claim is not that Congress performs any of these functions sufficiently, only that it does, in fact, perform them. And we should value the institution for doing so inasmuch as we need these functions more than ever. My claim is not that all is going well in congressional politics, whatever that would mean, but simply that we would be worse off without it. I've given my lectures titles drawn from famous phrases from important figures from the founding era, 2 from the Declaration of Independence, 1 from George Washington describing the creation of the constitutional system. Today's lecture is titled A Decent Respect for the Opinions of Mankind, which references Congress's representative function. Looking back into the history of American political thought, it's actually rather difficult to find clear articulations of the purposes of legislatures. The legislature has generally just been taken for granted as a fundamental building block of a republic. After all, there was a Continental Congress long before there was a Constitution. Dating back from more than a century before the Declaration of Independence, there were the colonial assemblies. Over time, those assemblies rose to power as authentic voices of the people in the colonies. They struggled with the crown and with colonial governors as they represented the interests of constituents, and they laid the groundwork for the American Revolution. So if one turns back to the debates over the framing of the Constitution, it was just assumed that a legislature was necessary, and there was also early and broad consensus that it should be bicameral. As they sought to get the Constitution ratified, the authors of the Federalist Papers needed to defend many aspects of the system, but nobody challenged them on the need for a national legislature or asked them to defend its purposes. The lack of controversy over the need for legislatures means that there's a dearth of theorizing about them in the American political tradition. Of the founding generation, John Adams voluminous work, gives us the most to work with in terms of thinking or theorizing about the basic structure of government. So I'll start with Adams and return to him from time to time. Representation is a complex concept, but John Adams in 1776 gives us some benchmarks for assessing it. So the principal difficulty lies, and the greatest care should be employed in constituting this representative assembly. It should be in miniature an exact portrait of the people at large. It should think, feel, reason, and act like them. The people in miniature is needed because, as it was termed then, the people out of doors are too numerous. But what Adams is saying is that the purpose of a legislature is to reflect the people out of doors as well as possible. Following from Adams, we'll assess Congress on these two dimensions: the people in miniature, which I'll understand as socio-demographic representation, and then its capacity to think, feel, reason, and act like the people. Adams was pointing to more or less the same dimensions of representation that 20th century political theorist Hannah Pitkin famously described as descriptive and substantive. Socio-demographic representation, or descriptive representation, refers to whether a legislature's membership reflects the diversity of backgrounds and interests in society. This is what people mean when they ask about whether an institution is representative. Most of the time they're referencing this form of representation, this mirroring form of representation. It's very important for the legitimacy of a legislature, and increasingly so for institutions of all kinds: workplaces, academic departments, panels at conferences, television news broadcasts. But it's obviously especially important for the legitimacy of a democratic institution. Political representation, or substantive representation, occurs when legislators act on behalf of constituents, speak on behalf of constituents. Do they think, feel, reason, and act like their constituents would want them to? So my plan now is to take stock of how Congress measures up on these two dimensions of representation: socio-demographic and political. Does Congress look like America? Does Congress think, reason, and act like the people it represents? And I'll tackle the second question first because it is the more difficult one. In assessing whether Congress thinks, feels, reasons, and acts like the people it represents, one should look first to the party composition of Congress. Party is the single best predictor of the issues that a member will focus on, the positions they will take on a range of these issues, how they will vote on the matters that are presented to the Congress. This has long been true. This was true even in much less partisan eras. Party was still the most reliable predictor of member behavior. It's obviously exceptionally true today. The same, of course, is also true of voters. Knowing a voter's party affiliation tells you more about them than knowing any other more about their political views than knowing any other single fact about them. In partisan terms, Congress reflects the country surprisingly well. Our 50-50 Congress accurately reflects our 50-50 country. In the 2020 elections, President Biden won 51% of the national popular vote. That year, Democrats won 51% of the House seats and 50% of Senate seats. In the 2022 election, Democrats won 49% of the House seats and 51% of the Senate seats. So there's no significant disproportionality here. The parties are getting the share of power that they deserve based on their support in the electorate. This is actually a surprisingly close alignment for a system based on single-member districts. The most important argument for systems of proportional representation is that representative systems using single-member districts like ours can yield very disproportionate outcomes. After all, a party that wins 51% of the vote in every congressional district would win 100% of the seats. But we don't see anything like that kind of disproportionality, none of these gross distortions in our current Congress. There's no guarantee that our system will yield proportionate representation in partisan terms. But interestingly, that correspondence between the presidential vote and the composition of Congress has been much closer in the polarized era since the early 1980s. This graph displays the president's share of the two-party vote shown in the columns, and the Democrats' share of the House, shown in blue, and the Democrats' share of the Senate, shown in green, over time. Back in the 20th century, Democrats used to hold seat shares in Congress that were wildly disproportionate to the vote share their candidates would win in presidential elections. Even when presidential elections even when their candidates, Democratic candidates, would go down to defeat in presidential elections, Democrats would still hold healthy majorities in Congress. But across recent decades, the correspondence has been much closer. At times, Democrats have held fewer seats in Congress than you might expect based on the presidential vote, sometimes more. At many points, the House and the Senate counterbalance one another. During the Obama years, Democrats held fewer seats in the House than you might have expected based on the presidential vote, but more seats than you would have expected in the Senate based on the presidential vote. So it's worth noting that there's no large-scale distortions in aggregate representation due to gerrymandering. Republicans and Democrats arguably have roughly the share of representatives in Congress that they should have. Congress encompasses a wide range of views. Even the crankiest Americans can probably find at least a few members of Congress they really like. Each party still encompasses a spectrum of perspectives, from moderate to hardliner, even though the ranks of the moderates are smaller than in the past. Factions from across the political spectrum can all find champions in Congress. They can circulate among themselves viral clips of members of Congress to show that their voices are being heard and that their grievances are being reflected in Congress, sometimes only by a lonely voice or two, but at least heard. There's a long history of members of Congress taking up and championing the concerns of even small, unpopular groups. It's a point that veteran congressional scholar Louis Fisher often makes. He argues that Congress actually has a better track record than the courts of standing up for small, discriminated against groups. Think, for example, of New York Representative Bella Abzug introducing a gay rights bill in Congress in 1974. Think about just how out there such a stance was in 1974. Her bill was co-sponsored by another New York representative at the time, future New York Mayor Ed Koch. This was long before the major parties would go anywhere near the issue. But given the diversity of districts, there were at least a couple of members willing to take up the cause of gay rights as early as the 1970s. The diversity of congressional representation goes beyond ideological questions of left versus right. Congress also gives voice to opinions that are outside the mainstream of elite consensus. Consider when Oklahoma Senator James Inhofe tossed a snowball in the Senate to suggest that maybe elites weren't right about their views of global warming. Or consider when Georgia Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene wore a Trump-won face mask. Or when Representative Ilhan Omar compared Israel to the Taliban. Or when during COVID, Senator Rand Paul confronted Tony Fauci about the virus's origins or the role of natural immunity. In each of these cases, you had members who were reflecting many Americans out there who held these views. Right or wrong, it's part of democracy to hear views that are widely held in the public. On many occasions, these are perspectives that would not be represented in national government without Congress. Important linkages are being forged here to angry, distrustful people who could otherwise become alienated from politics. And as low as trust is in our national government, it would likely be even lower if there was no place at all where widely held views that are outside the bounds of elite or respectable consensus could be expressed. And Congress is often that place. In assessing Congress's capacity for political representation, it's worth pointing out that in most cases, members of Congress are the overwhelming choice of their constituents. This stands as a contrast with presidents. It's often said that presidents are the one national representative, the one office elected by the whole nation. But presidents do not normally stand at the head of any overwhelming national majority. They tend to win narrowly. This figure displays the winning presidential candidate's share of the two-party vote nationally. As you can see, it hovers just above 50%. On average, since 1974, just 51.8%. Meanwhile, on average, 85% of House members win their seats with at least 55% of the vote, and the same is true of 2/3 of senators. So when stacked up against presidents, members of Congress command very impressive vote shares among their constituents. And members are quite popular with their constituents. Even though people are rarely, if ever, happy with Congress as a body, they accept their own members as worthwhile representatives. Constituents normally rate their own members as deserving of re-election. Much of this trust is grounded in sordid partisanship, meaning that Democrats are trusted because they represent districts that are majority Democrat, and Republican members are trusted because they represent Republican districts. But sordid partisanship is not the whole story. Members of Congress are actually better at attracting swing voters than presidential candidates are. Congress is less elite than other policy-making institutions, and that is one of its strengths. It's pretty obvious this is true across many dimensions if you watch Congress, but for purposes of illustration, here's one indicator. Contrast the Ivy League backgrounds in Congress with the President's cabinet or the Supreme Court. Congress is a body of generalists. They are not elected to be experts in national policy, though some of them are experts in particular areas. Primary qualification for getting to Congress is the ambition and the self-confidence to put yourself forward, to ask other people to vote for you. There's not very much bureaucratic specialization in Congress. Members are spread across many issues. This means that when Congress is reacting to issues, it much more closely approximates what the typical person, or at least the typical Republican and the typical Democrat, will think about issues. There are many times when being highly educated will put oneself outside the conventional wisdom of the country. Even when that conventional wisdom is wrong, we need a body in democratic politics that routinely requires the experts to account for themselves in ways that the general public can understand. And experts are not always right. Sometimes you need an outsider to raise questions about the assumptions that they are making. Members of Congress have the self-confidence and the political authority to pose those questions and to demand answers. Finally, in assessing Congress's capacities for political representation, it's important to know that the ethos in Congress is to listen to constituents. It's not very hard to get a hearing in Congress. Members of Congress make time to hear from constituents. They take calls. They have an open door. They go out of their way to advertise their accessibility. Consider Arizona Representative Gabrielle Giffords' Congress on Your Corner, where she would set up a table in a grocery store parking lot to meet constituents. And that's where she was in 2011 when she was subjected to a nearly successful assassination attempt. I live in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of D.C., and I go down onto the National Mall a lot of days to get some exercise. And I routinely see groups from all around the country, trade groups and advocacy groups and business executives and school groups coming to Congress to be heard. They dress up sometimes in color-coordinated outfits. They go and have their photos taken on the Capitol steps. No governmental institution is more welcoming to outsiders than Congress. Constituents expect their members of Congress will hear them respectfully and take their problems seriously, and members respond to those expectations. Now, I want to turn now to the other requirement that Adams set for representation. Is Congress an exact portrait of the people? The answer is no. Congress falls short here. It always has. However, Congress has never been better as gauged by this dimension than it is now. One should not underestimate the importance of socio-demographic representation. As John Stuart Mill observed in 1861, in the absence of its natural defenders, the interest of the omitted is always in danger of being overlooked. Representation rests on the recognition that our views as human beings are always and inevitably partial. No person can see policy from all relevant perspectives. We need to hear from the full range of those affected or potentially affected when we make policy. Or as the lobbyists often say in Washington, if you're not at the table, you're on the table. A lot of empirical research demonstrates the connection between the personal characteristics of lawmakers and their behavior in Congress. I'll begin with one criterion for assessing socio-demographic representation that's often overlooked, and that's geographic rootedness. Congressional representation is rooted in place. This feature of the institution is often overlooked in favor of other sociological characteristics, but it's a form of representation that is quite meaningful for people. Geography is one of the most important sources of people's personal identity. Most Americans are rooted in place. We might think of American society as very geographically mobile, although Americans have the broad freedom to choose where they would like to live across the continent. Most people live near where they were born. About 40% of Americans have never lived outside their hometown, if you set aside college and military service. Nearly 60% have never lived outside their home state. Most people do not venture very far from their hometowns. This is especially true for people at lower levels of income and education. As summarized by the New York Times, the typical American lives only 18 miles from mom. Congress reflects that rootedness in place. It's built into the institution. The Constitution apportions congressional representation to states. Congressional law then, in turn, requires that one member represent each House district. Most members of Congress have long-standing personal connections to the constituency that they represent. Looking to the current Congress, almost half of all members were born in the district they represent. A strong majority, nearly 60%, were born in the state they represent. A majority went to both high school and earned their undergraduate degree within the state they represent. There have been only modest changes on those indicators since the 1940s. There's been some decline in this local rootedness and some increase in the share of members not born and educated in their state or district, but I'm more impressed here by the stability than the change. Members of Congress are less geographically mobile than other highly educated professionals. Congress is more like the American people in this regard than one might expect. And geography is a meaningful part of representation for most people. Upper middle class professionals may perhaps forget this source of political identity because they tend to be much less geographically rooted than most Americans. But for most Americans, geography, where they are from, is a primary source of identity. And it's striking how often this geographic tie figures into political campaigns. When a candidate lacks a significant personal tie to the constituency, that's a weakness that other candidates will exploit. You hear Congress's regionalism in the diversity of accents among members. There's a much wider range of regional accents in Congress than one encounters in other settings where national public affairs are being discussed. Like you listen to news broadcasts, representatives of presidential administrations, even discussions at most academic conferences you go to. I've compiled a short montage to illustrate this point. I'll play for you.
Speaker Emeritus Pelosi will go down in history as the greatest speaker of all time. The Throughout her time in Congress, she's been a legendary legislator, a fabulous facilitator, and a no-nonsense negotiator.
And that's why I look forward to very soon casting my vote to confirm Javier Becerra to lead the Department of Health and Human Services, one of the most qualified and forward-thinking minds that will have ever run the Department of Health and Human Services.
Well, first of all, I hope the Secretary heeds my fair warning, because it absolutely will happen. If he's still in office next year, he'll be impeached.
June 17th will mark 8 years since the massacre at one of the country's most historic churches, Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. That racially motivated attack took 9 parishioners' lives and injured 3 others as they participated in a Bible study.
For tenure at the Department of Labor as the Deputy Secretary, I'm aware that 4,600 new registered apprenticeship programs with 11,000 new employers partnering on or adopting regional apprenticeships have occurred. You worked with the former Labor Secretary, Marty Walsh, to help President Biden accomplish the fastest jobs recovery in nearly 40 years.
Amtrak was awarded 6-figure executive bonuses despite huge losses. You've attempted to take over Union Station's lease at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars with its speculative benefits returns. You forced unwanted routes on your national network with questionable customer demands and guaranteed annual losses. What's y'all's projected annual operating loss, Mr. Gardner?
Where I come from, Illinois, where 4 of my last 8 governors have been convicted on corruption charges. 2 of my immediate predecessors, with a couple exceptions, 2 of the last 4, have also been convicted of corruption charges. So, enough is enough.
I was the sheriff of my county in Jackson County in South Mississippi. Served 3 terms as the sheriff. Before that, I was a police officer. I spent 42 years total in police service. So that was my life. That's what I've done my entire life.
We overstayed the visa, just like many people did back then. We had our grandparents here who had paved the way for us years before we got here. And so we overstayed our visa. We didn't have our documents. We eventually had to go back to the Dominican Republic, where I was born, to get our green card. And finally, we came back, and I think we're very much part of the American dream.
Mr. Speaker. Oh, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to celebrate as a proud alumnus of the recently crowned 2020 college football national champions, the Georgia Bulldogs.
All right, that gives you some sense for what we're talking about with regional diversity in Congress. It's also worth noting that Congress is quite inclusive of voices from smaller cities and rural areas. One way of seeing this is just to compare Congress to the locations from which cabinet officials come, where they were born over the past quarter century. As you can see here from the left panel, the cabinet is dominated by appointees from the major metros of the East Coast, Chicago, and the West Coast, while members of the much larger Congress are also more geographically spread out in terms of their birthplaces. In a world where elite professionals and highly educated people are disconnected from local contexts, migratory in their careers and in their interests and outlooks, we need Congress to be custodians of the local, which is where most people live their lives. Right. Turning now to one of the most important factors shaping people's life experiences, race and ethnicity. The Congress today is more racially diverse than ever before. The number of Black, Hispanic, and Asian Americans have all been increasing in Congress. Across the past decade, almost every successive Congress has set a new record for racial diversity. In some respects, Congress has actually reached representational parity for minority groups. The biggest improvement has been in the representation of Black Americans, shown here in blue. However, if we bring the Senate into the picture, to be fair, racial minorities remain very significantly underrepresented in that chamber. Black Americans are severely underrepresented in the Senate. There are 3 black senators, falling well short of the 12% that would reflect the nation's population. Hispanic Americans are also significantly underrepresented. There are 6 Hispanic senators, about half as many as you would expect, given the composition of the country. Here's a way of sort of benchmarking racial representation in Congress. What I do here is I subtract the black share of the nation's population from the black share of House members. So when the bar goes below the 0 line, African Americans are underrepresented in Congress. When the bar goes above the 0 line, they are overrepresented, benchmarked against the share of the national population. You can see that African Americans have not been underrepresented in the House of Representatives since the 116th Congress, which was elected in 2018. Major strides were made, as you can see, in the 1990s, and again in the past 10 years since 2012. However, you bring the Senate into the picture. The Senate is displayed here with the green bars. Black Americans remain severely underrepresented in the Senate. So there's been some improvement here, but the change is very, very modest. The inadequacy of racial representation in the Senate is a significant gap. Hispanic Americans have seen their presence in Congress increase over 180% over the past 25 years. However, those increases have not been enough to keep up with the rising share of the Hispanic population. Hispanic Americans make up 12.7% of the population, but just 6% of the House. So you can see, even though Hispanic Americans have seen increasing numbers of House members, you see that the House is still falling short and increasingly short of representativeness on this dimension. And as with Black Americans, the problem is more severe in the Senate than in the House. However, racial minorities have achieved representational parity in the Democratic Party in Congress, meaning that the non-white share of the Democratic Party reflects the non-white share of the nation as a whole. Non-whites make up 42% of Americans and 43% of the Democratic Party in Congress. Republicans lag behind Democrats in racial diversity, though they've seen some notable improvements over the past decade. As recently as 2008, non-whites only made up 2% of Republicans in Congress. They now constitute 10% of the Congressional GOP. As you can see here, women's representation in Congress has been sharply increasing since the 1990s. Of course, the graph looks somewhat more impressive than it perhaps would be warranted if you see it tops out at less than 30%. But women make up a quarter of the Senate and 29% of the House. They obviously have a long way to go before they become 1/2 of all of Congress. Women are approaching representational parity in the Congressional Democratic Party. More than 40% of House Democrats are women. This is one of the more interesting stories of sociological change in Congress. Women were gaining, in terms of their share of Congress, at the same rate in both parties up until 1992, when suddenly the two parties diverged, with women becoming a large share of Democratic House members and mostly stagnating as a share of Republican House members. Republican women have seen some big gains in very recent years, up to 15%. Interestingly, you could say that the 2020 elections were the year of the Republican woman. In terms of religion, comparing the current Congress with the American people in religious terms, Congress looks reasonably representative. Each of the major religious denominations in Congress roughly mirrors its presence in the American public. The congressional share of each group is shown here in teal. The share in the electorate is shown in purple. You can see that Protestants are slightly underrepresented in Congress. Catholics are slightly overrepresented, as are Mormons and Jews. The only group that's significantly underrepresented in Congress are the nuns, those who identify themselves as atheist, agnostic, or not identifying with a religion. Class representation in Congress has weaknesses. There's no need to belabor this point, but members of Congress are much more well-off financially and more highly educated than the public at large. This graph displays statistics on education. As you can see, nearly all members of Congress have a bachelor's degree, as compared to just 38% of Americans. Working class people, especially people involved in manual labor, have never had much presence in Congress. This is an important way in which the life experiences of members of Congress diverge from the people they serve. Looking to wealth, the median member of Congress has a net worth of at least $1 million. That's true for both Republicans and Democrats, while the median American has a net worth of just over $120,000. The discrepancy is not quite as wide if you adjust for age, because most members of Congress are above age 55, and if you look at Americans who are above age 55, most of them are the average or the mean net worth of that group is $200,000. But there's no point denying the fact that in social class terms, meaning education and wealth, Congress is considerably more professionally and economically elite than the country it serves. Before closing out this view of Congress's membership, it's worth noting that the contemporary Congress is considerably more occupationally diverse than the Congress of the 20th century. Until the 1990s, most members of Congress had a law background. The Congress of the 1950s was mostly lawyers. There used to be a lot of jokes about that, of us having a government of lawyers instead of a government of laws. But there's been a long-term decline in the number of lawyers in Congress, shown in the blue line. There's been a significant rise in people with a business or finance background, shown in red. Just a lot more different types of occupations represented in Congress now, just flagging a few of the bigger categories. The number of educators has risen, partly as a result of the rising number of women in Congress. There's also more doctors and healthcare professionals. There are more labor leaders. Members with a background in agriculture have held roughly steady over this whole time period dating back to the 50s. Taking stock of Congress's membership has been something of an exercise in bean counting, but it's worth considering how all these sources of diversity create ties with the American people. The geographic basis of representation helps Americans all around the country feel more confident that there are at least some members of Congress who care about what happens in their part of the country. Research has shown that Black Americans feel more connected to their representatives when there is a basis of shared identity. They are more comfortable reaching out to their representatives for help and are more likely to remember their names. The rising representation of women has helped to draw more attention to women's issues in national politics, from child care to women's health issues. It's important also to think beyond simple dyadic relationships here. It often matters to an identity group to have at least some representation in Congress, no matter where that member is from. Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma has described how being a Native American gives him a national constituency, in which American Indians from all over the country look to him to listen and to give voice to their concerns. So rather than explicate the literature on representation, I think it'd be more helpful to look at an example in action. And so I'm going to play a short clip from Representative Cori Bush's victory speech after winning her St. Louis seat in 2020. The video quality could be better. This was likely captured on a cell phone. But I want you to listen for how she draws on her various identities, her gender, her race, geography, her occupation, as she connects with her constituents. She's using all these identities as a basis for her legitimacy as a representative of her constituency.
running for my life across a parking lot, running from an abuser. I remember one day hearing bullets whiz past my head, and at that moment I wondered, how do I make it out of this life? I was uninsured. I've been that uninsured person, hoping my healthcare provider wouldn't embarrass me by asking me if I had insurance. I wondered, how will I bear this? I was a single parent. I've been that single parent struggling paycheck to paycheck, sitting outside the payday loan office, wondering how much more will I have to sacrifice. I was that COVID-19 patient. I've been that COVID-19 patient gasping for breath, wondering how long will it be until I can breathe freely again. I'm still that person. I'm proud to stand before you today knowing it was this person with these experiences that moved the voters of St. Louis to do something historic. St. Louis, my city, my home, my community. We have been surviving and grinding, just scraping by for so long, and now this is our moment to finally start living. Let's finally start living. Let's finally start growing. Let's finally start thriving. So, as the first Black woman and also the first nurse and single mother to have the honor to represent Missouri in the United States Congress, let me say this to the Black women, the Black girls, the nurses, the essential workers, the single mothers. This is our moment.
Cori Bush may be more explicit than many members in pointing out the ways that her identities connect with her constituents. But shared identity is an important basis of representation more broadly, and it's not necessary for members to state such claims in so many words, though many routinely do so. As Richard Fenno put it in his study of representation in the 1970s, members of Congress are constantly looking for ways to reassure their constituents, I'm like you, I'm one of you. I'm going to conclude by recapping the main points, the key points I hope you will remember. We can point to many failures of Congress, and I don't deny them. It's a human institution riven by conflict. It struggles to act collectively. But Congress deserves 2 cheers for representation because it shows a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. Congress does so because it mirrors the partisan composition of the electorate surprisingly fairly. It encompasses a wide range of opinion and background. It is less elite and more accessible than other policy-making institutions. It's an important asset in a low-trust era. It's a body of generalists capable of channeling the voices of average people, asking the questions they want asked, pushing for the policies they want enacted. Its members win and hold office with wide support from their constituents. Members of Congress are more popular with their constituents than any national leaders. And Congress increasingly reflects the nation's diversity. However dysfunctional the institution seems in many ways, we should still acknowledge what Congress does reasonably well. Amidst a polarized society, a geographically far-flung continent, a citizenry deeply mistrustful of governmental authority, and a population increasingly diverse, we need representation, if anything, more than ever before. I'm happy to take questions. Yes, in the yellow shirt.
Danielle Allen has made the argument for dramatically expanding the number of House members, which she said would address greater representation, the Electoral College distortion, and even minimize gerrymandering. So what do you think about the idea of expanding the numbers of the House members, which I guess it hasn't been increased in almost a century?
That's right. I think one could make a case for some expansion. Danielle Allen's proposal goes farther than I'd be comfortable with. You know, you're looking at a Congress of more than 1,000 members under her vision. You have to remember, Congress serves multiple purposes, and representation is just one of them. So there's also lawmaking and the need for collective action. And by greatly expanding the number of members, you decrease the power that any individual member possesses. What that tends to do is it tends to empower leadership. The leaders in the House are much stronger than leaders in the Senate, and that's connected to the fact that the House currently is much larger than the Senate. And so a chamber 1,000 members strong, you'd expect it almost paradoxically to be more dominated by just a handful of key players than the current Congress is. So I think in terms of trade-offs, representation, you know, as in the structure of this lecture series, is just one of the things that Congress does. And so my inclination is not to try to maximize representation at the expense of other values. Thank you for the question.
So post-war congressional policy has taken many policy positions to their logical extreme, going from rail to highways, tying academia to national defense in the 1950s, Tonkin Gulf in the 60s, industrial deregulation in the 70s and 80s, tax cuts and pension privatization in the 80s, abandonment of the Great Society in the 90s, Patriot Act, and multiple tax cuts in the 21st century. At the same time, moderating social legislation during that period and beyond, from civil rights to immigration to health care. So what does that say about representation, the culture of Congress, and what does it say about, as an institution, its ability to both moderate and shape the opinions of people in the country?
That's a big question. I'll have to say that question will be addressed better or more effectively tomorrow if you're able to come back for the day I'll discuss lawmaking, because it's in that lecture that I'll lay out how Congress serves as a brake on partisan ambitions. When I think of Congress playing a moderating role in American politics, it's not by establishing a objective definition of what it means to be moderate. Instead, my view of what is moderate reflects what the most grand ambitions of either party, you know, has for American policy. And so what Congress tends to do, tends to dial back partisan ambitions. Like, parties come in with grand ideas, and what they tend to be able to do by the end of a Congress is just a small fraction of what they campaign on. And so that's the way in which Congress exercises a moderating function. I wouldn't make strong claims about what moderate means in some sense beyond that, which I hear in your question about what it means to be moderate on social policy, or what it means to be extreme in other policy areas. So if you'll bear with me, and if you can come back tomorrow, you'll hear more on Congress and its moderating capacities. Other questions?
I was wondering if you could comment on a different kind of representation or measure, subjective. How do the people represented feel about Congress over time? How has their subjective evaluation of whether they're being represented or not changed or not changed over time?
So Congress's job approval is low. It's not as low as it's ever been. It's not setting new records, but talking 20% of Americans approve of Congress right now. It's gone lower. We've had single-digit registers in the answer to that question. But Congress is not well loved. It never has been. There's been an ebb and flow in approval of Congress as an institution, but it's always low. And it's always significantly lower than the president, even when presidents are very unpopular. I mean, all our recent presidents have spent most of their time as presidents with less than 50% approval. And yet even 50%, that would be a great score for Congress in terms of job approval. But people don't like Congress as an institution, but they do like their individual member, and their individual members win by big margins. And most of the time, the American people think their members of Congress deserve re-election. So it's kind of it's a classic paradox in thinking about the ways in which Congress does and does not live up to Americans' expectations. Other questions?
You referenced Pitkin and substantive representation, and her definition is obviously a little bit different than what Adams was. The majority of the time, the majority of policies that Congress passes reflect what the majority of the people win or want what they want. And I'm not seeing that. I mean, she finds out in the late 1960s that that's true, but that doesn't appear to be true in more recent years.
Congress struggles with collective action. It's hard for Congress to agree on a common course of action. I think that reflects the reality of the diversity in the U.S. better than we can gauge simply by public opinion polls. It's usually the case once you get down into the nitty-gritty of policy, it's more complicated than public opinion polls can accurately reflect. I think the close divide between the parties, with our national elections being so unpredictable, points to an indecision on the part of the broad American public about what they really want in terms of public policy. And I think that indecision is frequently reflected in the Congress. It's a struggle. It's an evenly matched, pitched battle between two parties with different visions. And the American people have not taken a side in a clear or enduring way. They have at other points in U.S. history where they had a clear party preference, and you had a dominant party that remained dominant across multiple elections. In fact, across many years. The New Deal coalition, which defined much of the 20th century in American politics, that held power and continued to hold power for decade after decade. What we've seen in the post-1980 period has been a seesaw between the parties. And so I think that reflects, my interpretation of that is that it reflects an indecision on the part of the American people. They don't trust either party with power in any long-term way. Other questions?
When I walked in today, I would have assumed that gerrymandering is one of the great evils of our time. However, you reflect today, which was probably the biggest shock that I take away from today, is that we are, in spite of gerrymandering, we are somewhat reflective of the nation voting. However, would you argue, yes or no, that gerrymandering still precludes or continues to divide us or make the electorate more divided because of there is no, or the elections are not close enough to change representation in the variety of districts?
Thank you for the question. Gerrymandering is problematic for many reasons as we think about an ideal democracy. The idea that politicians can effectively choose their voters by drawing districts, and the way in which districts are drawn to advantage one party or another. It's just definitely troubling for for how a democracy should work or for questions of accountability. There are distortions that happen at in particular states. So there are states where the congressional delegation is out of step with the preferences of the state. But if we take a step back and just look at the composition of the Congress nationally, a lot of this is canceling each other out. You've got states that gerrymander for Democrats and states that gerrymander for Republicans, and in the end, it's not clear that either party has a clear advantage. And the composition of the Congress corresponds remarkably well with what we see in other national elections. So it's just a perspective on gerrymandering. It does not put to rest all the problems with gerrymandering, but it just says that at least there's one problem we don't have, which is a Congress that is composed in such a way that grossly distorts the partisan preferences of the American people as a whole. Other questions?